welcome back to the channel. Today the big question that we're going to discuss is, should you learn to code? I don't know, should you?
Hello there, welcome to my channel. Listen, after more than 12 years as a lawyer, I tried to start my own company. It was a startup and I was a non-technical founder. Sure, we managed to get a product to market, but you know what? I had a horrible time finding technical co-founders. In fact, I found a couple, but they ended up leaving. I was so sick of it. At the age of 37, I finally taught myself to code. But man, it wasn't easy. A year or so later, I ended up joining a startup as an engineer. And a year after that, I joined Google as an engineer. So listen, if you want to transition your career into tech, or you want to become your own technical co-founder, subscribe to my channel.
Ooh, good question. It's a hard one. No idea. Actually, that's not true. Alright, so by the end of this video, I'm going to try and give you maybe 5 or 6 pros and cons for each side of the debate about should you bother to learn to code. And at the end of it, I'll also try and discuss with you why I don't think that's actually a very good question. In fact, I'd argue it's a pretty useless question in many senses. Alright, so let's get on with it. Let's talk about the cons first, because that's how I usually like to do things, is look at the downsides first. Number 1, it's very time consuming. Coding is not the sort of thing that you can pick up in a weekend, no matter what you saw on the social network. Even if you're a pretty good hacker, chances are it's going to take you a lot more time than you anticipated or expected. But even just learning to code is a time-consuming process, assuming you know which bits you're actually even going to bother to learn. And believe me, there's tons of stuff to learn and it's always changing. Which actually brings me to the second downside or con. It's always changing. Like, it's a never-ending effort to keep up with what's new, if only to figure out whether you should even bother to learn the new tool or technology or API, right? And just the pace of change is so intense that a lot of people do get tired by it because it's kind of relentless. There's always innovation, there's always improvement. Just the sheer velocity, the speed at which things move in software engineering is quite astounding. It's unlike anything I've ever seen before. That evolution, that constant movement is quite tiring for a lot of people. So that's the second con. The third con is that it is pretty competitive. It's actually getting to be more and more of a crowded space. In fact, to me, it feels a little bit like the 80s and 90s were about being a lawyer, which is when I really went to law school in the late 90s. So I'm starting to think that today, in this day and age, especially after the startup hype and booms, it's starting to get a little bit like how law was in the 80s and 90s. So there's lots of people entering the market, there's a lot of demand, but there's a lot of people and a lot of competition. So it's starting to feel a little bit crowded in that sense. The fourth con, I'd say, is that the future is not guaranteed. The technology is moving at such a pace that it's one of those strange things where it may render itself obsolete in many senses. Now, I'm sort of sitting on the fence on this point, but I could see a world in which the state of AI evolves to such a point, especially with new technologies like GPT-3 coming out, or GitHub Copilot is a great example of this, where it auto-completes a lot of the code people would write. Now, it's one thing to auto-complete bits in your email. For example, your Gmail would sometimes auto-suggest things, or your search bar can do that as well. But when you start doing that for chunks of code, that's an early warning signal potentially to many people. And so I think that's one of the things we want to consider. Does this profession actually have a secure future, or is it going to be like other things where we automate a large part of software development and automate a lot of developers out of a job? And that's sort of what's happening in other industries. So why wouldn't software engineers automate themselves out of a job? I'd say con number 5 then is that it can be really frustrating, especially at the learning stage, but even after that. I'm sometimes surprised by just how much time I spend getting frustrated or irritated because things aren't working the way I expected. Now, that could be because I'm still always learning or I'm always operating outside my comfort zone. That's one explanation. But I think there is something inherent about the profession or about the practice of writing code where, because your feedback is so instant, which can also be a really good thing, but your feedback is so instant that it also makes it quite a frustrating process if you're muddling around, because you get instant feedback just how much your code sucks or it doesn't work at all. So, some people think it's a good thing. I happen to think that's a good thing, but I know it's a big argument why people find it frustrating to work in code a lot. So that's definitely something for you to think about. Another con that I've noticed personally, and it's just my personal opinion here, right, is that engineers are often fairly smart, very opinionated, and not necessarily the most tactful people. So they can be quite blunt, and I actually respect and appreciate that. But I reckon a lot of people, especially if you have slightly thinner skin, would find that social tendency in a lot of engineers to be a little bit confronting. So, that's something I would count in a con. So if you want to enter this world, you want to think about whether or not you can develop that thick skin or whether you can just ignore some of the bluntness that you're likely to encounter and that opinionatedness, especially when it's critical against you. Okay, so that more or less covers a lot of the cons. Now let's talk about the 5 or 6 pros. Now keep in mind, none of these pros or cons are in any particular order. I'm just riffing with you here. Pro number 1, it's intellectually challenging and rewarding. It's sort of like advanced level puzzles or simple level puzzles, but it is ultimately problem solving. And because you get feedback fairly quickly, when you're on a roll, it's really quite motivating. I'd even go as far as to say it's quite addictive. In fact, it's the only thing I've ever done in my life other than music where I often get into a state of flow, which is a phenomenal state to be in. Pro number 2, and this is one that I think may just be my favorite. Anyway, I think this one's really important to me, is that it is very creative. Writing code is creative problem solving, and creating products or tools with code is an act of creation. It is just wonderful. There was a time when mankind used to do it with their hands and with physical tools, but now we can do it with software. We can make things that improve either our lives or other people's lives. And even if it's something that seems relatively trivial, like you automate a boring task at work or you automate something, it's a wonderful experience to be able to create tools like that. That it's a sense of power and control, and the magic and mystery of it is just great fun. So I love that. That's a huge thing for me when I'm coding. Con number 3 is a little more pragmatic. Look, it is still a profession that's in very high demand. There is a skill shortage broadly in the engineering space, and because it has high demand, its economic value today is quite high. And so on average, coders get paid pretty well even for relatively junior positions. So that's a huge pro in my opinion. Personally, it wasn't a big driver in my decision to change into it at the age of 37, but I think it's a very valid reason to consider for yourself and for your families. Now, pro number 4 in favor of learning to code is a pretty important one, actually. Even though it's quite challenging and difficult, it is totally achievable. And not only is it achievable, it's one of those professions that have now completely legitimized that you can start a career in it and pursue a career in it without actually having formal qualifications. Now, as a lawyer, I know that's not possible as a lawyer. You need formal qualifications, you need a degree, you need a certification and a licensing, and then you need to maintain that all the time. So it's kind of gate-kept in some sense. There is a gatekeeper there, right? And it's regulated. Whereas engineering, right now anyway, is the kind of profession where anyone can get into. You can get into it as a hobbyist, you can get into it professionally, you can get into it as a tinkerer, you can get a job in it, you can even teach it without having any formal qualifications. Now that to me is quite stupendous, and I think it's something worth taking advantage of if you're really looking to do something like that with your life. Now pro number 5 is, well, quite simply, software runs the world. As someone said, software has eaten the world. Really, every business today, whether they like it or not, needs tech. Now, not all businesses are tech businesses, but they are definitely tech-enabled, right? Even education relies so heavily on tech now, especially in the post-COVID era. So it is so fundamental to the modern life and the modern experience and existence that it is highly relevant. That, I think, is a big pro in favor of software engineering or learning to code. Now, pro number 6, was also what I mentioned as a con. It's constantly changing. To me, that's personally very exciting because it means I haven't ever really been bored. In the 3 or 4 years that I've been writing code, I've not really been bored. It used to happen both in the law and in other things that I've done in my life that there were times then you would end up flatlining or plateauing a little bit unless you made a change. The good thing about code is there's always change as part of your ecosystem. And there's always new tools to learn, optimizations to implement, approaches to try, teams to work with, and problems to solve. The impact of all this change is that you're always on your toes. Now, it can be tiring. The pace of change can appear to be way too fast for comfort, but you're never going to get bored. And if you like learning and you're really hooked on that growth, this is a profession where you can continue to find growth as you keep progressing, which is great. Not a lot of professions can say that. Okay, so now that we've discussed some of the pros and cons, and I should say these are all just my opinion, the question is, should you? Should you learn to code? Well, I think you should if you fall into one of the following categories. One, you want to tinker, you want to make things, you enjoy the buzz of creating things, and you want to make tools or automate things in your life. Sure, give it a shot. Two, you want to start your own startup, or you want to be your own technical co-founder, or you want to build some sort of software as a service, SaaS company, then yeah, you should probably learn at least a little bit of code. Three, you want to do it professionally because there's a demand and you're happy to supply that demand with your skills. Great, go ahead and do it. You could be a data analyst or a financial analyst, and you want to augment your financial and analysis skills by using, let's say, some principles in data science. Or you want to learn a little bit of coding in order to run different kinds of models. And you want to move beyond just doing it in an Excel spreadsheet and actually want to use, a Python script to run a bunch of analysis. You want to improve your current role either through automation or by using newer technology, do your role better. Yeah, then you should absolutely teach yourself a little bit of code. But, and this is an important but, do not do it just because you think it's the new cool thing, it's some trend to follow, or you want to be technically savvy. Because those are fairly non-specific outcomes, and also they're slightly faddist. You're responding to some sort of fashion statement, if you like, in the market. And frankly, that's irrelevant because by no means is knowing code the only way to be successful. It's neither necessary nor is it sufficient. And those of you who know my work know I like to think in terms of, is this necessary and is this sufficient? Only do things that are necessary for your goals or that are sufficient in doing to get you to your goals. Coding may or may not be one of those things that help you get to your goals. So don't do it just because you think you're missing out on something or you think it's worth knowing just for the fun of it. It's honestly quite a bit of work to learn. And while it's totally achievable, it may not be relevant for your goals. And you may spend a whole lot of time doing something that's not relevant to your goals. So you just wasted a bunch of time. And now for the part that I promised you right at the beginning, why is should I learn to code not a very good question? In fact, like I said, I kind of think it's not a helpful question at all. Think about it this way. If I said to you, I want to be a musician, you'd be like, okay, what sort? Or if I said to you, I want to be an athlete, you'd be like, could you be more specific? So it's kind of the same thing with code. What is learning to code? At what point of time do you say you've learned to code? It's like learning a language. At what point of time do you say you know a language? Some people are really good at languages. Some people are really adept at a language. And other people are just sort of functional. But they both know the language, right? It's just a question of degree. But there's no bright line where you can say, now I know to code. It's very clear when you don't know how to code. But it's not quite clear when exactly you learn to code. And also, what is code? Is HTML and CSS considered code? Is SQL considered code? Do you need to know only C++ or Java or Python? These are kind of really important questions. And so learning to code is a very non-specific goal. It's a very non-specific question. So going back to the music analogy, being a musician is not really specific enough. You've got to choose an instrument. And similarly, learning to code is only meaningful when you talk about a specific tool or language or a combination of skills that make you able to write code. So that's why I don't think that's a great question. It's a good starter question, but unfortunately, a lot of people stop there. And a lot of the people I coach, I really push them to go a lot deeper into what their goals are and what they need to learn to achieve those goals. And then I give them a set of frameworks to help them understand when they would have achieved that goal. Now, before I go, don't forget our little ritual. We've got a little thing. We've got this deal going on. You've got to like and subscribe and comment so that I can know what you think and whether you'd like me to put any other content out there that could be of use to you. Don't forget, like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you next time. Take care.